Throughout history, spurs have been utilized by horsemen as a tool with which to communicate to their horses, able to guide their horses without using their hands. And that was the use of spurs. Welcome to 17th and 18th century horsemanship. Today I'm going to explore George Washington's spurs. Because what better way than to explore the history of spurs in the 18th century than by looking at the world's most famous and renowned horseman of his time. I went to His Excellency's estate at Mount Vernon. And got permission to examine some of his key horsemanship tools. This included a riding crop, travel bags, and 2 pairs of spurs that are housed in the archives. Now, with both pairs, we can understand Washington as a horseman before the war and after the war. Now, this smaller pair, obviously, they're a perfect analogy for his situation at the time. A little more humble, a little less noticed, and a little more to the point. Okay, pun not intended. After all, with these, he was volunteering his time and risking his life to be general of the army. Now, he wore these when he was made commander-in-chief in June of 1775. That means he would have wore these when he had to reassemble the army at Cambridge in Massachusetts, which was a feat in and of itself. Apparently, he had a really ragtag army to deal with. And you can see how both pairs almost perfectly reflect his stages of life when he had these. General, president. Now I'll dive into the material culture of these, what materials they're made from, maybe where they were worn. But since spurs are a tool, and Washington used them as a tool, I'm also going to explore the equine psychology for why spurs are even needed. As a general, as a president, as a backcountry rider, spurs are ideal. You don't always need them, but if you're as good a horseman as Washington, you know how to use them properly so that they actually help the horse as opposed to hurt the horse. And this is another reason Washington was such an excellent horseman. These are a perfect symbol of that. So because of that, I'm going to explore Washington's war mounts and the horses he partnered with. His 2 favorite war mounts throughout the war, which was the chestnut Nelson and the half Arabian Blueskin, who was a gray. Both of those horses are very much famous in and of their own right. So as general, he would have ridden throughout the war with these spurs, or spurs very similar to these ones. So I'll be exploring the history of these spurs in relation to Washington, of course, the immediate history, what these spurs would have seen whilst they were Washington's. Then I'm also going to dive into the material culture, what they're made of, and of course, based upon the materials they're made from, where did they come from? And what was the culture around making these spurs? Who made them? Obviously, maybe sometimes jewelers also similarly made spurs. And some jeweler definitely would have been responsible for engraving. He would have been hired to engrave this lovely story that's inside. Presented to Lieutenant Thomas Lamb by General Washington's taking them from his own boots while giving his orders to Lieutenant Lamb at Valley Forge in January 1778 to proceed to Boston for supplies for the army. I'll explain not only the material culture, but the equine psychology and the history. And that'll give us a very full description, diving into the story behind these as a historian and, of course, as a horse lover. The American Revolution began, technically, in 1774. On June 15th, 1775, George Washington, a soft-spoken farmer from Virginia, was made Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. He exhibited values of self-discipline and care above all else. Now by his side, throughout the entire war, was a wonderful man, who Washington grew to, reportedly, deeply care for, William Lee. Both men were excellent horsemen. Years of fox hunting together and traveling between major cities ensured this. They would now have to leave the comforts of home at Mount Vernon to go gain a new family, one they would be surrounded by for the next 8 years, their military family. Lee was almost always by Washington's side, starting with the siege of Boston, which took almost a year. And by the time the Declaration of Independence was signed, both gentlemen were becoming seasoned military men for this budding nation. Battles continued, days dragged on, lives were lost. And not in many of these battles did Washington actually win. The First Battle of Trenton, however, was a long-needed American triumph at the end of that year in 1776. This was when Washington took his horses, cavalry, and infantry across the Delaware, and then defeated the Hessians in an epic and much-needed victory for the Patriots. The war continued throughout the year of 1777 and ended with the infamous winter encampment at Valley Forge. And in comes the story of this first set of spurs. Washington had likely been wearing this pair for the entirety of the beginning of the war, with all the battles I just mentioned. And it's here at Valley Forge he would remove those spurs from his boots for the last time. And here the story gets a little touching. Leading parts of the infantry was a young lieutenant from Massachusetts named Thomas Lamb. Now, if you've followed some of my last videos, you'll know that the Battle of Brandywine, which took place in 1777, September, ended with the British taking the Patriot capital of Philadelphia, which meant Washington could no longer go there for supplies. And if you know the story of Valley Forge, you'll know that his army was desperate for food. It was a harsh winter, and he and his army were sort of surrounded by civilian towns that didn't sympathize with the war or Washington's army. For this and other reasons, Washington's army lacked supplies, especially food. So, Washington had to ask one of the few Patriot cities he still had, which was Boston, way up north, for supplies. Lieutenant Lamb stepped forward and offered to relay this information himself. It would be a long, treacherous ride, some 330 miles up north to Boston from Valley Forge. It was winter, it was harsh, and above all, British provincial cavalry was on the hunt to catch any patriots, let alone Patriot messengers. Now, at a brisk trot, a horse can travel 8, maybe 12 miles, and this means 330 miles would take some 6 or 7 days to reach Boston from Valley Forge. Basically, all this means is this ride was a little intense. It also means that Lieutenant Lamb was very brave. So this was not to be taken lightly. Washington knew this. He knew all of this. And to, I think, bless Lamb, certainly show him his thanks, Washington makes this gesture. He takes off the spurs from his own boots. He brushes them off and hands them to Lieutenant Lamb. Now, these spurs had sort of been a companion tool for Washington throughout this war so far. Well, the young man's journey was about to begin. Lieutenant Lamb mounted his horse with the new spurs on his boots and began his treacherous journey. He went past Philadelphia. He went past New York, somehow evading capture the entire time. And he also managed to avoid freezing and starvation. Basically, Lamb and his horse at this point were proving to be tremendous athletes. So, he reaches Boston, or rather, he's just outside of Boston, and unfortunately he has some sort of accident. But don't worry, he manages to survive and relays the information to Washington's suppliers.
Now, this accident that he had is sort of important to Lamb's life because he and his horse were both injured. It's unknown what the injuries were, but basically, well, we'll come back to that in a minute. The injuries managed to allow him to serve, but not for much longer. Long story short, Washington's orders went through, and those Boston suppliers managed to get through, gathering big barrels of flour to be shipped to Washington's army in Valley Forge. Massachusetts, and actually Connecticut, were at this point large grain suppliers for the colonies, now the new states, and yes, they were sympathetic to Washington. So these supplies reached Valley Forge and were likely given to one of the many army bakers who went about baking bread, and maybe passed out the flour to the soldiers for their rations. They could make things like fire cakes and dumplings, which were not luxury foods. They were basically just having flour and water, but it supplied the men. As the records go, Washington tried to inspire his soldiers through these simple gestures. By taking his spurs off of his own boots and giving them to Lamb, he was showing the young man his thanks. He had a massive soft spot for noble gestures. Lieutenant Lamb would continue his service, and would do so serving through the year of 1778. But his injuries must have been worse than originally thought, because in 1779 he was discharged from duty. Because, and I quote, "the injury was preventing him from serving." Now, this does explain why the spurs are in such good condition as they are. Lamb clearly valued them, but regardless, because of his discharge, he could really save them. And after the war, he started a family, and those spurs became a family heirloom. Now, one of Lamb's children, it's believed, maybe a son or a daughter, took these spurs to a jeweler long after the war and got this story engraved on the inside of the spurs. Now, these then later passed through his line further to his great-granddaughters. Their names were Miss Amy and Rosamond. Now, those ladies donated these spurs to the Mount Vernon Ladies Association in the 1950s. These spurs managed to reside permanently with their original master on the same state. They came back to Washington, having originally left the estate with him when Washington began his journey of the American Revolution. The conclusion is that Washington was a gentleman leader with a soft spot for noble gestures, such as Lamb volunteering his life for this mission. These spurs had encountered everything, from Boston soil during the siege, to maybe water splashed on from the Delaware, to snow at Valley Forge, and all battles in between. Now, they found their way back to Mount Vernon, and that is where they reside to this day. Lamb saved them very carefully, as did his family, because they had been on the heels and in the hands of one of the greatest men in history. This next pair they also have has an interesting story as well, though a little more obscure. These are dated around 1795, which is during the presidency of Washington, when he was first president of the new nation. Talk about having the weight of the world on your shoulders. And these spurs show that. It was a role he did not necessarily want, but he was always a man to do his civic duty. So these spurs are much more presidential, and they look it. These were also a gift that Washington gave someone. As the story goes, they were a token to the Brockenborough family, who were a Virginian family that he visited along his travels. Now, that family lived along the Tidewater section of Virginia, and the family safely kept these spurs, and it became, yet again, an heirloom for generations. And again, it was a descendant, a lady, who donated them to the Mount Vernon ladies in the 1950s. Closer toward the 19th century, you began having larger rowels on spurs. Those are those large stars on the end of the spurs. Now those have practical applications, but as they are that large, They're also meant to be ornamental.
It was during Washington's presidency, and then afterwards he would have had these as well. Off the top, the style has changed. These ones for the army, they're very thin. These ones, very flashy, very big. So immediately the heel is already much thicker, and it's brass and steel. Whereas these ones in the army, obviously they're much thinner, a little more precise. They're silver. These are the flashy spurs that they want a president to wear. And these stars are made out of steel, which is very interesting because the history of steel in our country was beginning to be a really big deal as well. Lots of steel mills were in Pennsylvania. Washington was very much the businessman, so he would have known where to get the best product. One thing that was very important to Washington was uniform, but of course these are also a tool. So he would want items that don't fail him, and of course steel. Today we have brass steels, we've got, brass spurs. Of course with these, he was president. It's very possible they were made specifically for him.
Now what's great about her is I hardly have to do anything and apply any kind of pressure. Of course, I taught her a long time ago that just the slightest touch means please move sideways. And also the pressure doesn't just come from this, it comes from what we call in Pirelli your intention. They can feel invisible body pressure. So if I tighten my stomach and I look at her, hey, move sideways please, she will listen. Because that's how horses communicate with each other in the wild or in domesticated herds of horses. This is what works. So when I put the intention of just my leg or my heel and the spur slightly touching her side, she should go sideways. Also, the spur doesn't have to be a tool for making them go sideways. It can be a stretchy tool as well. Now that it's spring, they're shedding their winter coats, so she is especially itchy. Oh, girl. Growing up, I was always told the story of how spurs originated, and there's got to be historic truth to this as well. It's a story I've never forgotten. It's that they were first made by bullfighters. Men in the ancient world actually created spurs to help guide their horses sideways in the bullpen to get their horses out of the way of the bull that could charge them and kill them. So for that and other reasons, the spur is actually meant to be a very humane tool, not a bad one. So if you keep remembering that, you're going to know that men like George Washington knew how to use the spurs effectively. It's not just to make a horse go forwards, it's also to make them go side to side. And you can use that in practical applications today. There are loads of times when we still need to be able to go sideways. In older times too, if you're riding along a fence line and you have to open a gate. I'm sure George Washington had to have this problem too. You can open a gate without ever getting off your horse's back if you know how to sidle your horse up to the gate, unlatch it, and then have them sideways back or sideways into opening the gate. It can be a very fluid dance-like motion when you know how to use your spurs and you teach your horse how to understand the spurs properly. Thank you again for joining me. Come next week, I'm going to have a part 2 to this video series, studying George Washington's Spurs, where I'm going to learn about and explore his horses. He had several horses throughout his lifetime, and they deserve a story all their own. So, in the meantime, thanks for watching.